Now that we've cleaned up our page using the Angular Material card component, let's replace this raw JSON data with an Angular Material table. As always, we'll first check out the documentation before we add in our component. On the left, I have the table component selected under the components, and then under the Overview tab, what we're trying to implement is this basic table within our page. Up here, it states that this table builds on the foundation of the CDK data table. The CDK table, for example, is part of the Angular Component Dev Kit. It gives you the same table structure, but with no default styling. In our case, we want the styling, so we'll use the mat hyphen as our prefix. We'll be getting more in depth with the CDK when we implement our drag and drop in the next module. In this case, we'll use the material or the components table in this video. To implement a basic table, there's a few steps to this, and we'll walk through all three of these steps in this video to implement this table. The first step is to set up our table, our outer container. Then we could use what's called the MatTable attribute directive, and here it even shows us how we could pass data into our table. I'll paste this example into our project to get us started, but as usual, before we can update the HTML, we need to bring in the module. So let's first bring in this MatTableModule into our TypeScript file. Back inside of our data display component, like we did with the MatCard module, we'll bring in our table module. And then also we need to make sure we bring this within the imports of our component. And I'll add that towards the end of our MatCard here. For now, that's the only changes we need to make. And then we'll update the HTML next. Inside of the MatCard element we set up in the last video, we'll replace this temporary pre-tag here. And we'll add in the snippet out of the documentation to get us started. We'll update this with our own data source, and we set that up in the last video. And this is how we could pass the data into our table. And if we go back to the TypeScript file and then scroll down and we have the data source set up within the class, I'll copy this and then go back to our HTML and replace this with our data source. Notice that I'm using the mat hyphen and not the CDK hyphen. So we should have some styles being applied to our table. Before we start implementing our table rows within this table, let's look in the documentation on how we can implement step 2. In the browser, we're no longer displaying any data because we have an empty table element. So let's take care of that by setting up our columns. Back in the documentation on the right, select Define the Columns, step 2. And we'll use this example here to get us started. We'll need to set up several of these for each one of our columns. In this case, they're setting up one column. It's called score. They're using the ng container to wrap all the column elements together under this one column. And they're defining this column group by using the mat column def, and they're calling it, in this case, score. Inside of this column group, we have a title header. This will display the column title. And then the TD tag, that's the title data. And this will actually show the value of each one of our rows. Let's use this example within our project to get us started. Inside of our table element, we'll add in our first column, the snippet out of the documentation. And then we'll update this from score to ID. This will be our column definition. The column title will be ID. And instead of user, I'll rename this to product. And the table data we want to show is the product ID. So this one column should show what we have inside of here, the ID of this product. There's a few more columns we need to set up. We need to set up the name, category, price, and stock. I have a snippet already made for these four. I'll paste them in to save time for this video. In the HTML, right below the first column, I'll add in the other four columns. And now we have a column for our name, category, price, and stock. And that completes step 2. Now let's move on to step 3 and set up our table rows. In the browser, you'll notice it still looks the same, and also if you look in the console, you'll see this error now, and that's because we haven't set up our table rows, and we'll take care of that in step 3. And on the right, select Define the Row Templates within the documentation. And in this step, there's a couple steps. We'll first need to go into the TypeScript file and set up our column list. And then within our template, we'll use this example to set up our table rows. Notice we define our header row with the columns to display. They set that within the table row header. And we also use this list within the row data. Let's first update our template with this example here. Right below our last column, the stock, we'll add in our table rows. And we'll only need to update one thing, and that'll be this. Instead of my row data, I'll just call it something like row data. And we'll keep this name the columns to display. And that's the only changes we need to make for our table row. But now we need to set this up within our TypeScript file, and we'll do that next. I'll just clean this up a little bit. Make sure we save this file, and then we'll update our TypeScript file. And then within this class, we'll add a new property. I'll add that at the top. And it's the same columns to display, and that should match what you have right here. And this is a list of columns we want to show. And that's the only change we need to make within the TypeScript file. Let's test this in the browser and see if we have a table. Now we're displaying a table with all of our product items, and also you should no longer have an error within the console. Now this was just a basic setup. There's so much more we could do with this table. For example, adding pagination. And we'll implement that in the next video.